Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 73. And this episode, we wanted to talk about those that don't really talk that much. The idea of silent protagonists in video games, where they work, where they don't, where they are, and also kind of defining them a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's funny. We were just talking about with someone offline about this, but like mentioning silent protagonists is like setting off a starter pistol for me to talk about my favorite game of all time, which is, of course, Chrono Trigger. Chrono, the lead character of that, being completely silent through all of it. I mean, I guess the basis for this, and something that I always considered an RPG trope, but actually it's in lots of different games. The silent protagonist is a avatar for the player, right? It's someone who doesn't speak, everyone speaks to. There's an understanding that the character is sort of speaking, or at least agreeing, but there's no words being said by the character, as if the player was filling in those words and then the character is responding to you in real time. That's the idea behind it, to make you feel like you're in the shoes of the character.
It is absolutely an element of immersion. Although before we go much further, I do need to push up my glasses for a second and tell you that Chrono does speak in one ending.
Oh, yes, that's true. You're right. He does.
In one specific, very difficult to find ending because the criteria to get it is such a narrow time in the progression of the story.
Yeah.
To be pedantic for a moment, there is that. But for all intents and purposes and in all aspects of what the silent protagonist typically is, Chrono is absolutely a shining example of that. And it's also why I, at the start of things, said why we kind of define it. Because there are a number of characters that I would consider silent protagonists that will get some lines here and there, and we'll get into those. But yeah, the idea of a silent protagonist is one of, when it works best, is of immersion. It started... Early games didn't really have narratives.
Yes.
You know, Pong, Space Invaders, you made your own. But as early 80s PC games started to give you dungeon crawlers and RPGs, you made your hero. So you were that hero, so you give them that personality. Why would they put words in that character's mouth? You go and interact with people, and that comes to you. So you would definitely go to RPGs for that. And a number of other games a number of other genres, that is, don't rely heavily on what characters say. It's why it was such a weird watershed moment when Mario welcomed you to Mario 64.
Right, because the character had not spoken before that. There was no vocalization for that.
Right. And there were conversations, sort of. Super Mario Brothers 3, Super Mario World had characters speaking to Mario.
For sure,
but he didn't have anything to say.
Yeah, well, and even with Link in the first two Legend of Zelda games, you know, you can encounter people in towns and they would speak to you and they'd have things to say, but you couldn't say anything. And then it wasn't until the third Zelda game on the Super Nintendo, where A Link to the Past, where there were clear conversations. You would talk to shopkeepers, you talk to your uncle, finger quotes, the princess, Ganon, whoever, and Link never said anything. And that only got exacerbated as we got into like the 3D Zelda games, and like even the most recent one with Breath of the Wild, tons of cutscenes with the Guardians, with Zelda herself, and Link saying nothing, making noise, because Link famously has made lots of noise, lots of yat, hut, ha.
Link vocalizes, but he doesn't speak.
Correct. And like that, I never considered it weird in the early games, but it was, and I think I remember talking about this on the show at one point. It seems odd in Breath of the Wild, just because it's the first fully voice-acted Zelda game, because even the Zelda games in the N64 and GameCube generation, they had like single words spoken to represent the character's voice, but it wasn't fully voice acted. It wasn't until Breath of the Wild, because Wind Waker didn't have voice acting, did it?
I don't think it did.
No,
and
I don't think so
either. Even all the way up to Skyward Sword, they had vocalizations at the top of things, but they didn't have fully voice acted speeches or anything like that.
Yeah, and it wasn't until Breath of the Wild where we got like full extended cutscenes with characters monologuing or having conversation, like especially the hidden cutscenes that you can find with the camera in Breath of the Wild, like just Zelda talking, Link reacting, but not saying anything. It wasn't bad per se, just to me, it seemed so bizarre because up until that point, we hadn't had that experience.
Yeah, Link is a funny one to look at. He's sort of a Rosetta Stone of silent protagonists. I mean, I'm not sure if this is exactly what it is, but I've heard it enough times that it may as well be true that the character is named Link because he is the link between the world and the player.
Yeah.
So there's dialogue and words from the very first screen of the game. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this.
Yeah.
But there wasn't any need for large scale speaking, and in fact, at that point, most Nintendo protagonists didn't speak, and several of them have gone on to do so. Mario is one of them. Samus, who would have internal monologues and thoughts in Metroid Fusion and beyond, and even was voiced in Metroid Other M, which, yes, happened.
Yeah.
And it's funny that Link is the one that over 30 years of games and releases, it does definitely feel like we are butting up against sense and logic. We're in the idea that Link doesn't have anything to say or doesn't say anything. They give some interesting explanations and subtext in Breath of the Wild for Link to be silent in a world of people speaking.
Yeah.
But all of the other games, it's an interesting artifact to be carried through. And nowadays, when the N64 came out, there wasn't a ton of space for digitized voice on the cartridge. There was on the discs, but not cartridge. So, but nowadays, you don't even need a disc. You can have a lot more depth of conversation in even the simplest of games, the most indie of titles. So when you make a character, your character, in fact, silent, it has to be a choice. And those can have many different effects and outcomes, I think.
For sure. And I mean, it's funny, going back to you talking about Mario. So Mario first had a voice in N64, never did before that, except in the cartoons and stuff. Captain Lou Albano, may he rest in peace, was the voice of Mario for quite a long time.
Respect.
But the most standout silent protagonist to me in the Mario world is Mario himself in Super Mario RPG. Because in Super Mario RPG, now in the later RPGs, in Paper Mario also he doesn't speak, but in the later RPGs, like the Mario and Luigi games, they just talk nonsense. They make mouth sounds. But in Super Mario RPG, Mario pantomimes everything, can shapeshift somehow, which to me is hilarious, but is never explained. But can't say anything. He doesn't speak. All the other characters speak to him.
Yes, and I'm very glad you brought that up. Yeah, Mario RPG is one that I made a note of. Like, that is the pinnacle of crossroads of the silent platform protagonist, the silent RPG protagonist, the weird extents of storytelling that could be done without using words. Because at the end of this, to me, a silent protagonist isn't necessarily one who doesn't make any noise. It's one who has no intelligible words for you, the player, to disseminate from. So in that sense, Mario as an RPG character has always been a silent protagonist, even as he and Luigi, yeah,
exactly.
Well, actually, to be fair, they do declare their abilities when you switch between them in Superstar, fire, jump, thunder. So, again, we're stretching things a bit. But silent protagonists definitely come up as a strong trope within RPGs because of just how much story, how much interaction. It's not just run to the left, jump on things. It's not just shoot everything that moves. It's interact and learn and glean and journey. So to have a central cog of the entire experience have nothing for you to glean their personality other than the reactions of others, choices you make in your decisions, it creates this wonderful amorphous barrier that allows you to put more and more of yourself into the character. We aren't able to name nearly as many of our RPG protagonists now as we could back in the 8 and 16-bit days, which allowed for us to name characters after ourselves, after our best friends, after our enemies. In the case of, the rival from Pokemon.
Right, exactly. I did that in Chrono Trigger for years. I would always name the characters after my friends, except Magus,
Exactly.
because he's too cool to rename.
Yeah, he's Magus. That's just what you do.
Exactly.
So, right, and that is another element of how we were able to put ourselves into these characters and feel even more invested in the journey, which is... In talking about all this and thinking about all this, I just always go back to the PS1 era and everybody going, man, we can fit so many voice clips into these games. Let's do that. And not always being a good idea. I mean, to be fair, we could do that in the 16-bit era. Bubsy.
Oh, Bubsy.
Exactly.
Definitely the opposite of a silent protagonist.
Right. I mean, one of my favorite platformer games is Gex, the original Gex for PS1, Saturn, 3DO. I have the PS1 version. And has like 300 different quips, all from comedian Dana Good. And you know what? They're funny the first couple of times.
Yeah.
And then it just grates on you. I was looking up, in doing research for this episode, I found a sort of trailer for Crash Bandicoot 2 that had a CGI representation of Crash being voiced with an Australian accent, talking about the game. It was like this 3-minute long video. And it was a perfect case study in sometimes less is more. Having Crash scream and make little noises here and there, and everyone else can talk around him, fantastic. Because you know what? We don't need to hear what he has to say. That sounds awful, but less is more in this case.
For sure.
It doesn't help the story to have him quip.
No, definitely not. And what's interesting is Sonic went the opposite direction of Mario, right? Like once he could speak, he spoke all the time. And it worked for Sonic. And it worked for Sonic for the most part. And tons of legends have lent voices to him over the years, most recently with Ben Schwartz in the movie. But Mario as a character was designed to speak, but only minimally. And there's never been large amounts of dialogue, even now in an era when he could talk if they wanted to. Charles Martinetti, who voices Mario and most of the other Mario-related characters, gives them a ton of voice, whereas...
Right.
It's considered an RPG trope, but you just mentioned Crash, who's a famous platforming mascot who doesn't talk really at all, as opposed to Spyro, his counterpart, who talks quite a bit, voiced currently by the incredible Tom Kenny. And I think it's interesting that when we reach outside of RPGs also, it becomes, depending on how well the game is made, it's pretty quick to forget that you're not speaking because it doesn't even seem necessary. And I'm talking about characters in first-person games, which have been my bread and butter this year to a bit, like Jack from BioShock, Shell from Portal, the Doom Guy, Corvo from Dishonored, all of these characters, because you have this first-person perspective and characters talking at you, you don't really skip a beat by not having your character say anything, because
the point of immersion is deeper.
Right, because you're a device to move through the world and have the things happen to you.
Absolutely. I do want to delve into first-person shooters more, but I do want to mention something that just occurred to me. The earliest voice for Sonic that I can think of is the Sonic Adventure Saturday morning cartoon, where he was voiced by Jaleel White.
Of course, yes.
So Sonic has gone from Urkel to John Ralphio.
Wow. I feel like in a way we've come full circle.
We have come full circle in the worst way or the best way. That's just the thing that I know, and now you must all suffer with me.
That's fair.
But you're right. First-person shooters are an excellent environment for that. And what's funny is even back in the days of Doom, we had a case study in opposites, because you had, your Castle Wolfenstein, your Doom guy, your very gruff space marine going through fighting all of the denizens of hell and Nazis and monsters. And then you had Duke Nukem at the same exact time.
Yes, another character who didn't do much shutting up. And that said, like, I love that character for what he was at the time where he was around. You know, I loved him.
And he wasn't having conversations. This wasn't moving the story along. This was quipping.
Yep. Yeah, famously by John St. John, who still does the voice of that character constantly for tons of stuff. In fact, I believe most recently he revoiced him for Bulletstorm's Nintendo Switch version, has Duke Nukem as a playable character in it.
And by all accounts, John St. John is just a great dude in general, and he does a great job with Duke Nukem. But that being said, this is one of those things of like, just because we can make them talk, do we have to?
Yeah.
How often should we? How much do they need to? It's a thing to consider.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, you know, it's easy to forget that this is a standout thing sometimes too. Like, besides the first-person shooters, like even stuff that are third-person, like Grand Theft Auto 3 is one of the most famous games on the PlayStation, one of the most famous Grand Theft Auto games, and the birthing point, more or less, for the modern open-world game. But
it is a game changer in so many ways, absolutely.
And the lead character, Claude, doesn't speak. And honestly, I was watching a video, I think it might have been The Completionist, recently recompleted it and mentioned that he's silent, and I went, wait, is he? I played that whole game. I thought he spoke, but he doesn't. It's not till Vice City that the lead character has a voice, but in Grand Theft Auto 3 he doesn't talk, and I'd completely forgotten that because the story is so immersive and interactive that you don't even think about your character talking because he doesn't need to.
Yeah, it's a lot of your choices. Which missions do you take? What crimes do you commit? Where do you go? Your choices inform the character in so many ways. And the first two Grand Theft Auto games and Grand Theft Auto London 1969 also had silent protagonists, but because they were top-down arcadey romps, it didn't matter as much. It felt like it was part of the same fabric and world as all other sorts of games of that ilk to have a silent protagonist. To then carry that over into as much of a living, breathing world as Rockstar could give the PS2 at the time, it is very funny to look back and think of the way that, you know, not just the Grand Theft Auto series, but those sort of open world sandbox games in general have grown and have become more vibrant and deeper, and the vertical slice of experiences everywhere. To go back to its birthing pains and see, wow, he didn't have anything to say, but it was still a revolutionary game in so many ways. And I think having a silent protagonist for the first one, I know it's Grand Theft Auto 3, but you know what I mean? But, you know, they could start voicing the characters in Vice City. And I'm not sure if this was like a grand, long-reaching scheme of theirs to be like, no, we've got to ease them into this. I think it was just a matter of like, well, what do we have them say? What do we do? Well, we're working on all this other stuff, and allowing people to get into this kind of vibrant world, not having to worry about your character having the same 6 phrases he says over and over again when he steals a car, means that you stick with it longer, that it feels more living and breathing that way. Having the NPCs sometimes say some of the same things, you're like, whatever, they're NPCs. But when it's your character saying the same 3, 4, 5 phrases, it grates on you and it takes you out of that immersion, the immersion that every other piece of design in that game gives you.
For sure. And I mean, also, sometimes it's not even about your immersion. Sometimes it's just about the flow of a game. I mean, when we think about Shell from Portal, from both Portal games,
yes,
because there's only been 2, there should be more. I know too much.
I don't know.
I know. A lot of people argue that it's a complete series and there doesn't need to be, but there's never too much GLaDOS as far as I'm concerned. But that said, like, GLaDOS as a function, that character, that dynamic, especially for the first game, would only work if your character didn't speak, because the comedy, the pacing, the puzzle solving, all of that hinges on how GLaDOS interacts with you. And it's stronger because Shell doesn't speak and you can just have those riffs. Even in the second game, where then you also have Stephen Merchant and you have the over the loudspeaker J.K. Simmons raving about making lemonade and smashing lemons.
Cave Johnson.
Like, all of that stuff works. All of that comedy and spectacle works because the main character isn't saying anything and is allowing it to just happen and the player to absorb it.
and you're able to attribute your own interpretations of Shell's silence.
Right.
Whether it is like she is battered and bruised and malnourished and like has just been a test subject for so long or dealing with this and like has nothing to say, or all the way to the other side of like, don't talk to her, that'll just encourage her. Whether it's, beaten or long suffering or ignorant or whatever you want to attribute to it, the silence speaks volumes in several directions, and it's up to you as the player how you interpret that. And by making those leaps and choices, you are connecting to your avatar in that way, even when the avatar has a name, a face, and a backstory.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, there are even games that have played the silent protagonist for a joke. I mean, Mario RPG, while they weren't making fun of it necessarily, the game was made by Squaresoft at the time, pre-Square Enix, and clearly some of that was to poke fun at Final Fantasy and the silent protagonist a little bit, because they made those games and and that's why Mario would like shapeshift and change into the characters in pantomime, because it was a gag way of getting around making him speak, but also keeping him silent like a typical RPG character. And then alternatively, in the 2 South Park RPGs that came out, which were phenomenal, the new kid, who is the same new kid in both games, is silent because they're making fun of RPGs. They end up calling him douchebag and some other things, but like he is effectively silent just because they want to use it as a running joke through the game, because the developers and the creators of South Park understand that kind of comedy and want to make it a gag.
Yeah, it's leaning on the trope to use it, to make fun of it, to use it.
Yeah.
And I mean, thinking on Mario not having dialogue in any of the RPG games that he stars in, the thing is, Mario has been such a character for so long, you have certain expectations of who that character is, and I'm sure Nintendo definitely has expectations of what Mario is supposed to embody and be. And once you start giving him dialogue, to not go into certain emotional corners or other spots on the emotional spectrum feels cheap. But you don't necessarily want to hear Mario snark at somebody. You don't necessarily want to hear Mario be big and mad.
Yeah.
But by having just him fall flat on his face when someone makes a dumb joke, which is a very anime thing and is applicable across the board regardless of the character, you can have Mario react that way without him saying hurtful things. And by the same token, Link, despite the fact that it is not the same Link from game to game, giving Link dialogue at this point in the proceedings would almost feel like everybody has their interpretation of how Link is, how he sounds, who he is, whether he is shy and reserved but heroic, or whether he is truly, well, excuse me, princess.
I was just going to bring that up.
Exactly. Another instance of, do we need to give this character dialogue? And that's just the cartoon.
Well, remember, it's not the only place he's had a voice. He also had a voice in the CDI games, too.
Yes. Yes, he did.
Also, not necessarily fighting for the positive side of him having a voice, but still he did.
This is important evidence to have. Yes, it is. And so, yeah, it's very funny the different ways that we can play with that. And even in very serious RPGs, the notion of the silent protagonist can be played for very interesting story beats. The sequel to Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross. Fantastic RPG.
Let's not get carried away here. Fantastic?
I will say it is a fantastic game and a great RPG.
Okay.
That, unfortunately, does not belong in the Chrono series.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, also, as I've said on the show before, it's been many years since I played it. I played it anticipating it as a sequel, and I think that if I went back to it now, I'd probably enjoy it more.
Yes.
Like leveling my expectations. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I played Chrono Cross way after the fact. And so I think that's why I could come at it and like, wow, this is actually really well designed, really cool. Okay, it took me a little bit to get into some of the nitty gritty of the battle system, but I like doing that. So I think it's a great game. And Surge, the protagonist of that game, is a silent protagonist, despite being in a very vibrant RPG world, one where you can recruit dozens of characters and not to mention other townspeople and other folks, and you're making all kinds of decisions. And this is a mild spoiler, I'm sorry.
It's fine.
But I'll try to obfuscate some details. There does come a point where Surge starts talking, and which is weird for, I guess, the big link from Chrono Trigger to Chrono Cross is your protagonist doesn't speak. But when Surge starts speaking, no one in the game seems to think anything's wrong. You know something's wrong, and it is an indication that something is very, very wrong with Surge.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes and the next stage of the game is writing that. They actually did a little bit of that in Super Mario RPG: The Thousand Year Door. It's not Super Mario RPG. It's just Paper Mario: Thousand Year Door. I'm sorry.
That's true.
When Dupless, a ghost, takes over Mario's form, and you need to be able to like say his name in order to break free the spell, and there's a whole quest. And there's a whole thing where it's, all of your partners don't realize anything's wrong. They're just like, man, he's gotten really chatty. Mario doesn't normally say anything, but wow, he's got a lot to say. I don't know, whatever. So you can use the same trope and idea for laughs or for drama. And it's funny that when you have the player experience of a silent protagonist in a world where it is assumed the protagonist speaks, when the immersion breaks or when the rules change mid-game, it could be a big indicator and a big shift and can be a very effective beat in a game's story and its proceedings.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and on the opposite end of that is a game I played very recently that you and your incredible spouse lent me, actually, Owlboy. This indie game, the lead character is specifically stated to be mute. He can't speak.
Yes.
And that's very interesting to me because also it's not used in a way to like make fun of him for not being able to speak. It's not poking fun at a thing that some actual people can't speak. Instead, it's just his best friend in the game, loves him and, never speaks for him. And the character and the sprite art is very expressive. But what's fascinating to me about it is because the lead character doesn't speak, it's not treated like the other characters have to speak for him, and it's also not treated like the character is speaking and we're just not hearing it. It's declared that he can't speak, and so the characters will interact with him and he'll react physically and they will understand and continue to have a conversation, not excluding him. And it really pays off in the ending in a way that I don't want to ruin, but like it's super effective, and it made me not only respect the sprite art a lot more because this character's face, shoulders, arms, all were super expressive because he didn't speak. It also was a different spin on why this protagonist was silent. It wasn't just assumed that we can't hear it and that we're filling it in. There was an actual reason for why he couldn't.
And it lets other aspects of the medium be emphasized and helps share the load of storytelling.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, the sprite work, the world in general of Owlboy is just beautiful.
It's really incredible. It's become one of my favorite games that I've played this year so far. And what's really fascinating is like, just go online and look up GIFs of Otis, who's the lead character, Otus, and the expressions he makes. Like his surprised expression, his eyes bug out of his head. His smile is the biggest smile I've ever seen on a sprite character. Like it's really well done in a way that I couldn't even begin to imagine. And there are tons of other games that we've lauded on this game that have great sprite work, but there's an emotionality to this character that I've just never really ever gotten from any other sprite-based character.
And I think they knew that not having dialogue for the character. And this was a game that had a very long development cycle. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one of those, like, based on, I'm pretty sure just one person made it. So they could take their time with it. And by making that choice, there's lots of different ways to communicate. And by allowing the sprite work and allowing the artwork to be more expressive, you're still expressing even without there being walls of text.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting to me when we look at all these different silent protagonists that we've talked about, how they're all done a little bit different too, right? Like at the top of the show, we were talking about how there are rules, finger quotes, to the silent protagonist. The fact that they can make noises, but some of them don't, and some of them appear to be speaking and we're just not hearing them, and that all of them are considered silent for different reasons or in different ways. I mean, the rookie in Halo 3 ODST, the reason he's silent, I think among many things, is because they also had an insanely star-studded voice cast, half of them from Firefly, and so they wanted to show that off a bit too. But it also it allowed you to feel like a rookie, like a newbie, like someone who had never been in those situations. And so when everyone's talking at you, throwing orders, telling you what to do, you're silent because you're taking the information in on a character level, which is a different way than, like, for example, Chrono we were talking about before, who we assume is reacting and speaking. We just can't hear what he's saying.
Yeah, he's basically silent Goku, and that's fine.
Right.
Well, like there is a clear, like, he is sort of heroic and leader-like and just very there's a lot of qualities there. But yeah, like even games like the Ghostbusters game that came out during PS3 360 era, where they got the old voice cast, and you play, the rookie, and you don't have a voice, but in much the same way, you have a star-studded cast. And if you've got the Ghostbusters game, you're not doing it to hear what your dumbass has to say. You want to hear the Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
And
they played up.
They give it space,
right? And they play up gags in that too. Like every time the character goes to speak, someone interrupts him, or like it's never that he can't talk. He's not a mute. It's that you're
talked over.
Yeah, he's constantly talked over. He can never get a word in edgewise. And it was a brilliant conceit. And actually, fun fact: the look of the lead character is based on the lead developer, the guy who created the game. He's the face of that Ghostbuster. But yeah, and I think that the silent protagonist, for the most part, is always in service of bettering the game it's in. I don't know.
At its best, it is.
Right. I can't think of any examples of where it doesn't work, but I imagine you might have some.
I mean, some do argue that Gordon Freeman in Half-Life, his muteness does a disservice to some of the storytelling.
Yeah.
Because he is a distinct character that you are portraying, and one that you are taking through a lot of different situations.
Right.
And whereas something like Portal, which is a quick, contained, as it were, experience, and one where you're in a very, like, okay, I'm dealing with all of, like, circumstances change, but you're in the same setting in a weird way. But Gordon Freeman, through all of through both Half-Lives, through episodes and things, there's a lot that goes on in different characters and conversations that happen. You're not just having an AI voice berate you. You're not just having a lunatic shout over the loudspeaker. You're interacting. And for Gordon Freeman not to do that, some feel it is a strong choice, and others feel that it is wearing the idea a little thin. But on a flip side of that, I mean, the Stanley Parable is a game within that I won't say world, but with the the framework, where not being able to speak or not speaking at all is extremely important. And I like those. Even BioShock, the first BioShock, you technically speak in the first cinematic,
right,
and then don't speak again for the rest of the game. And that serves the story, and that's very important. And I know you were talking about when the silent protagonist doesn't work.
Sure. Well, also, like Jak and Daxter, famously in the first Jak game, he doesn't speak at all. But in the later games, he does eventually start speaking, and they actually play it up that it's so weird that he suddenly talks.
And it's also a big shift in genre from Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, to Jak 2.
Yep.
You're right. People made a big deal out of that, and I imagine that's also one that if I did any sort of delving, I would find some very strong opinions.
For sure. I think that it really depends on the game and how you feel about the game. I mean, for me, like like Pokemon, the Pokemon trainer in every game doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
They can't speak at all. Ash does in the anime, but in the Pokemon games, you don't say anything. But again, in those games, it's the kind of character like Chrono where you're not saying anything, but that doesn't mean the character's not necessarily speaking.
Right.
There's a lot of that in the new Fire Emblem, Three Houses as well. Like your character can say words here and there, and like you talk in battle, like saying battle cries and stuff. But during gameplay, especially during like any of the interactions, for the most part, characters are talking at you. You have reactions, and then you choose what you want to say. But the character doesn't actually say it. The voice acting doesn't kick in. They react to the choice you made.
Right. And Fire Emblem, much like Pokemon, are ones where your choices matter a lot.
Yep.
The units you take with you, the people you ally with, and build relationships with. You know, if your Pokemon trainer had a certain personality to them, and then they started training Pokemon in a way that was completely opposing to their characterization, well, then that's not your Pokemon trainer, and that's not your team anymore.
Yep.
So their silence is, again, another important piece of allowing you to feel free to make the choices you make. And really, they only made jokes about the protagonist not speaking in anytime Red shows up now. And I like that they only keep it to him.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also, like, I would say that the silent protagonist works more than it doesn't, right? I think that as long as it's used within the game in a way that works, like going back to talking about silent protagonists that define their games, the kid from Bastion, that whole game works because of the narrator's silky smooth tones and the way that he's narrating everything. And then you get to interact with him eventually. Like, the fact that your character doesn't say anything because everything's being narrated for them in a similar way to the Stanley Parable, right? Like, that this character's actions are spoken about, and when you do stuff, both on purpose or by accident, the narrator says stuff and you don't speak, lends to the awe of that game and the great calamity.
Yes, and it allows you to have very immediate effects on the world around you. There are so many games that have, for decades, we've purported like such an immersive world and all of your choices matter. Thank you, Peter Molyneux. But stuff like Stanley Parable or Bastion, where you make choices and then there's a narrator who comments on it. You don't need your character to say, like, you know, screw you, old man, I'm going off the rails. You know, you do something and then there's a commentary. Well, the kid seemed mighty interested in what was going on over there. Spent some time. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, we don't need to hear what the kid has to say about it is largely immaterial in service of the narrative. And I think, I'm sure if we rack our brains, we can think of a number of silent protagonists that fall flat or don't quite work. But this is a great argument in terms of design, cinematic immersion, world verisimilitude. Less is more. And there are times when allowing the players to fill in the gaps can be far more effective. And sometimes when you add too much voice acting or too much attitude, let's say. Too much attitude, you end up throwing people out, pulling people out of the groove they were in, out of enjoying the game, out of feeling like they're having a one-to-one effect on this world, however big or small it may be. So, I don't think every game needs a silent protagonist, but I feel it can be a wonderful, strong choice and very effective.
And there's some overlap with my New Year's resolution update and silent protagonist, as I have very recently, within the last month, completed the first Doom of the new Doom games, Doom 2016, and it was an absolute blast. And my favorite part about how the gag works for that is in one of the opening scenes was while you're gathering your gear, a screen flies in front of you that has like one of the scientists that you'll be working with throughout the game, kind of giving you the overarching story. And before he can finish explaining the situation, Doom Guy just slams the console to the side, picks up his gun, and takes the fuck off. Like, he doesn't care. And it's...
Let's talk more gun!
Pretty much. And the game was phenomenal. It was arcadey as hell. It was a blast to play. Honestly, for someone who doesn't love first-person shooters, or that's not true, I'm trying to disprove that, right? As someone who didn't have a lot of experience with them, when you put it on the easiest difficulty, it doesn't give you a hard time about it, and the game still has its challenges. It knows how to scale back for someone who's not great at first-person shooters, and I was still challenged by it, and it was still a lot of fun.
And that's fantastic. And I'm glad, certainly in this most recent console generation, I feel like games are a little less like, what are you doing picking easy mode, baby mode kind of thing. So, you know, and a lot of them are very much like, you don't have to, they even describe in the difficulty, don't stress about the battles, enjoy the story.
Yep.
And so it is much more noting that people want to have complete experiences and be a part of this world. So whether or not you have your characters speak or how they interact with that world the players are joining is important. And I know other first-person shooters and other first-person games utilize silent protagonists in effective, largely effective or slightly effective ways. I know plenty of Call of Duty games do it, and I can't name them because I haven't played a ton of them. I'm just aware of that academically. One that we didn't touch on, it's not a first-person shooter, but Five Nights at Freddy's is another game that made use of less is more in so many ways, and even having the silent protagonist meant, I think it also dovetailed nicely into Let's Plays.
Yes.
I think Markiplier playing the Five Nights at Freddy games would be far less enjoyable if your player character was also freaking out.
Yeah.
You just let them be, you make your own choices, and we can all have this wonderful experience together. It's a nice thing. And I'm getting some silent protagonists in my New Year's resolution as well. I'm kind of rotating between a couple of RPGs at the moment, so I haven't completed any games in the last week or two because I'm currently playing Dragon Warrior on the NES, Pokemon Gold on the Game Boy Color, and Persona 3 Portable on my Vita. And all of those are varying levels of silent protagonist as well. And the protagonist from Persona 3 actually does have a voice actor, but they are only to grunt, scream, yell persona when they use the evoker, all of that. But they are still technically silent protagonists. So I'm getting a whole bunch of them, and hopefully within like a week or two, I'll just knock out a bunch of games.
Yeah, I'll be honest. My first-person shootering is going to fall to the wayside a little bit because not only did I get Dragon Ball Z Kakarot as a gift, which I've started, I've got the Mega Man Zero ZX collection on the Switch, which I'd never played, and I started playing. But also, after spending time with Eric and Kenneth of Normandy FM, the other Mass Effect podcast, although they've moved on to Dragon Age, they're doing Dragon Age Origins, talking to them about it and talking about me possibly being a guest when they get to Inquisition made me start playing Dragon Age Inquisition again last night, and I got sucked into it, and I'm really mad at them.
Yeah, that's dangerous.
Because I've got no time for this. But I am going to play The Outer Worlds once it comes out on Switch, which I know has been kind of postponed due to some health issues in their studio, the porting studio. But that's on my list. And I did buy Wolfenstein: The New Order, which is the newest of the Wolfenstein games. And I played a little bit of it, and it was okay so far, but definitely not as arcadey as Doom was. So requires some adjusting. Right. I did start playing BioShock again because it's free on PS Plus, or it was last month. And that game, graphically and gameplay-wise, doesn't hold up as well as I remembered it, which is a bit of a bummer. It's still fun, and it's still brilliantly made, but like, I don't have the sense of awe I had when I first played it, which I was kind of surprised by.
It's a game that was an important step of evolution. It's like going back to Grand Theft Auto 3. Yeah, it's you still can have fun with it, but where games have gone, where that series itself has gone, and where other development ideals have stood on that game's shoulders. So you go back to it, and you're just kind of like, okay, I mean, it's nice, it's not bad.
Yeah. I do want to take a few minutes to talk about PAX East, which, as of when we're recording, I am still recovering from 4 days later. It was a blast. I was there on my own as a special guest. I had a badge that said it and everything. I was a part of All's Fair in Love and BioWare panel with Kenneth Shepard, Liana Rupert, Morgan Shaver, and Jesse Vitelli. We discussed the love interest in the BioWare games, mostly Dragon Age and Mass Effect, and then we argued over who the best and worst are, much to the dismay of our audience in the best way. We had a great crowd. If you came out to that and you're listening now, thank you so much, so much for coming to that panel. Also, I met a ton of awesome folks there. I palled around with SDGC quite a bit. I made a lot of new friends, many of which who I want to have on this show. It was insane. It was a blast. I don't know if you've ever been to PAX East, Geoff, but like, it was a damn whirlwind.
I've gone a couple of times. I think I've gone twice.
Yeah.
It is wonderful and a lot of fun, and I'm sad I couldn't make it up this year, but maybe next year we'll both go.
Yeah, I would love that. And just some highlights. There are some games I want folks to look out for that I've already yelled at Geoff about in our text thread, but There's Star Renegades, which is an indie game that looks like if Octopath Traveler was set in sci-fi. It's really cool. It's really beautiful. Boyfriend Dungeon, which I haven't shut up about since I first heard about it. I got to play it hands-on at PAX East, and it was phenomenal. The weapons are sexier than ever. Definitely keep an eye out for that. Also, She Sleeps Elsewhere is an incredible game. It's got like Undertale, Earthbound vibes, and it's an all POC cast, main cast at least, which is amazing. And I met the lead developer, and he was a delight. My favorite game, though, I think that I saw on the show floor is actually Harmonix is coming out with a new game. And anyone who knows me knows I'm a big music nerd. They're putting out a game called Fuser, which is like their board game Drop Mix, but better because there are no peripherals. It's a DJ game where you're a DJ and you make mixes on the fly. Everything's color-coded to the buttons on the controller, and you just drag the records down and mix things together, and it played so smoothly, sounded so good, and was so phenomenal. It's easily the game I'm looking most forward to, and it's coming out for every console and PC this fall, which is phenomenal.
Nice. Well, they're bringing their amplitude roots back. Nice.
Pretty much, yeah. And it teaches you how to drop it on the beat because there's a small meter above the DJ rig that shows you where the beats are, so you can drop it. It's really brilliant. It's going to launch with over 100 songs, and I just kept putting the vocals to All Star by Smash Mouth over everything else because it was hilarious to me.
The Lemon Demon route, I see.
Yes, exactly, pretty much. They said there's going to be a full career mode, customizable avatars, you can export your mixes. I'm very excited about it. I got to briefly talk with one of the Harmonix. I don't know if he was a developer, but he was someone who worked at Harmonix. I helped SDGC get their interview with them, and he was a delight, and like the excitement for this game is pretty palpable. Like they want to have, not necessarily that they want to have another hit, but they love their audience and they love the engagement of Rock Band, and they wanted to recapture that in a way, and I think this game might actually do it.
Yeah, no, they've consistently been a pretty great company in terms of evolving with trends and putting out quality music games. And as a huge fan of music games, I'm very excited about this as well. I just downloaded like 3 different demos on the Switch of games that were like, well, that's got music in the name. Is it a music game? Yep, great.
Amazing. I also met a ton of awesome folks in the media scene, other fellow podcasters, shows like Irrational Passions, RPG University, the Constantly Calibrating podcast, although I got turned onto their podcast just to find out that they're ending that podcast and then starting a different project and a different podcast. So still awesome, still great to meet those folks, but maybe don't tune into Constantly Calibrating, tune into Bear Punch Media on Twitter, and they will tell you what they're working on next because that one's ending.
Well, at least you got the trail, which is nice.
That is true. And I met awesome folks within the industry too. I got to play Doom Eternal. I got hands-on with that, which was phenomenal. I died a lot because I'm still not great at shooters, but it was fun the whole time. If you thought it couldn't get more visceral and more metal, you're very wrong because it's both of those things.
Excellent.
Yeah. And the whole PAX East was a whirlwind. I'm sure I'm forgetting things to talk about, but like I had a blast. It was great to be there in the capacity of someone who is interested in engaging with gaming more than just a gamer. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but because
having the opportunity to get a lot of different viewpoints.
Yes.
Throughout a very dense weekend. It sounds like you had an amazing time.
I did. It was a lot, but I did. And also, like,
Good.
It gets me excited for things to do with this show and with fun and games in general. Jeff and I are always looking to figure out how to innovate this podcast, and we have a lot of ideas and stuff I want to bring to y'all. And going to this and hanging out with the SDGC crew, shout out really quickly to Finn, Reb, Derek, John, Justin, and then even the folks who weren't there from that crew. Like, they ushered me into this community in a way that I never thought possible and made introductions within the industry that I never thought I would get to make. And I will be endlessly thankful for that because it's a great community and I'm great to know all these folks. And all of them are very eager to yell about video games with us, which at the end of the day is what we really want to do.
That is exactly what we want to do. We want to celebrate the things that we love and support the people around us. And that also goes to you, listeners. Don't you be a silent protagonist. Let us know what you think. Sorry, that occurred to me like 40 seconds ago, and I'm like, I got to do it.
Yeah, you're the worst.
I am the worst. But again, don't you be. Or be your bad self. What are some of your favorite or least favorite silent protagonists? What are... after going to PAX East, I'm energized about what we can do with this podcast and where it can go from here. Let us know on Twitter, on Discord, whether the podcast or our personal Twitters. Let us know what you think. Let us know some of your favorites regarding this episode. Subjects you'd like us to speak on, or just say hey, because we do love shouting about video games and we love making this a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.